Well, thank you for staying with us. Welcome back to Benin Network Center. Now, Gabon has become the latest African country in recent times where the military has executed a coup to remove the democratic government from power. Now, the Gabonese president Ali Bongo was deposed by the military on Wednesday, 30th August 2023, days after winning the presidential election in the country. Now, according to the report, soldiers were said to have appeared on Gabonese national television in Gabon to announce that they had taken over power. How did we get here? Now, the COUP also announced the annulment of Saturday's election and the dissolution of the democratic institutions in the country. Now, speaking on Gabon 1 and Gabon 24, the spokesperson of the COUP said he was speaking on behalf of the Committee for the Transition and Restoration of Institutions. The development in Gabon comes at a time Economic Community of West Africa States, ECOWAS, the African Union, AU, and other international bodies, as well as countries, are making efforts to restore democratic rule in Niger Republic following the recent military coup in the West African nation, in which President Mohamed Bazoum was ousted from power. Now, in total, 7 African countries are currently under military rule, following a coup in their various nations. Now, these are some of the list of the countries that are currently in the hands of military. Now, Republic of Chad, Republic of Niger, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and of course, Guinea is there, Mali, then Gabon, which is one of the recent countries that was taken away from civilian rule. To join us discuss this all the way from United Kingdom is Dr. Tony Agbo. He's a global affairs analyst. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Tony Agbons.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.
Always a pleasure having you. Also, right here in the studio, we still have with us Emmanuel Obakbolo Esquire. He's a legal practitioner. Now, let's quickly get to Dr. Tony Agbons. Now, take us through the coup with the recent one in the country, Gabon. How did we get here, and what is the way forward?
Yes, thank you, Dan, for your very cerebral intro to this discussion this morning.
Thank you.
Greetings to everyone there in Benin City and Edo State and Nigeria and all over the world who are watching this program. When you look at Gabon, again, it's another metaphor of what has always been the problem, with leadership in Africa. In fact, Gabon has been a laughing stock, when you look at the Committee of Nations. This is a country where, since their independence, I think apart from like 8 years, for the remaining 56 years, it's been ruled by one family. So this president that was removed early yesterday morning, Ali Bongo, he took over in 2009 from his dad, who ruled Sudan from 1967 until he died in office. Every election, his father, was always just putting himself there. Every election. In fact, there was a time in Gabon, it was just a one-party state, only one political party. And then later on, just before he died, he now allowed multi-party. And even with that multi-party, he kept on winning the elections. Opposition, they were hounded. It was pure autocracy in Gabon. And then in 2009, shockingly, when he died in office, the son just continued from there. Excuse me, where is that kind of thing done? Is it a monarchy where a king or a queen dies and then the children takes over, or the eldest son or the eldest daughter? You transfer power. It's not by a progenitor. So, and then he took over in 2009. Okay, then he came in, and then 7 years later, because they have 7 years tenure in Gabon, then the 2016, there was violent election in Gabon that took place. Contested with one popular diplomat who have worked with United Nations, a very exposed individual. That election was fraught with irregularities. There were manipulation. but he held on to power. And then, by the time his second tenure was ending, he, along with his thieving politicians and parliamentarians, they altered the constitution for a third term. And then they had this election on Saturday. Another flawed election. International observers and monitors were not allowed. Even at some point, they switched off the internet in Gabon so that people cannot communicate. And then the result was released. And here we are. The military have kicked him out. So it is just a shame that, again, we just finished. We are still, debating the issue of Niger Republic, Mali, like all the countries you mentioned. So it's a shame.
Okay, let's get back to the studio. Barrister Emmanuel Obagbolo, with Gabon being the latest hit by the military, how will it affect or impact Africa as a whole?
Africa is already worried. The African Union is battling with the issue on ground, particularly ECOWAS, with regards to Niger. And here we are. I remember the last time I was in this studio, I did ask the question, who next? And here we are, we've known who is next. And the same question I will ask again, who is next?
Let's not
now,
pray.
Let me take you
like that.
through the history of Gabon.
Okay.
Gabon gained independence on the 17th of August, 1960, even before Nigeria. And in 1967, the then president selected Albert Omar Bongo, the father to the Oxt president, and he became his deputy. That president had died. He now assumed the office of the president. And immediately he assumed the office of the president, he now came up with what he called unitary system of government, one-party system. And the man ruled like an emperor in Gabon until 2009 when he died. Now, his son took over. He was so autocratic. Not just that, he came up with a system of government, gerontocracy. And that was practiced in Gabon. And his son took over from him in 2009. And here we are. See the celebration. ECOWAS. Now, I want to look at it from this angle. In the early 2000, between 2010 and 2015, we had what is called the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And people say, oh, it was an Arab affair in Africa. Then now, we had the West African wind. Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea. And we say, oh, let it end with the West African wing. But now we are experiencing the Central African storm.
Have Gabon now.
So, if you sum all of this together, it goes to tell you that democracy is not working in Africa.
All right,
democracy is only for a few.
Okay.
And that is what bothers me and bothers some right-thinking persons. That democracy is about the people. Why is it that African leaders have chosen to be emperors? Immediately they assume the office through democratic means, and they begin to rule the people, doing things only that connects their whims and caprices. So I fear for who is next.
Let's get to Dr. Tony now. Dr. Tony, we saw how they were jubilating. Some of these countries where their presidents were removed by the military, we saw a lot of celebrations. Do you think the people are actually happy with the military takeover?
Not at all. The people are not happy at all. And that is why you saw the euphoria. And it's a similar thing that happened in Niger Republic. It's happened in Mali and other places. People are not happy. And like the barrister was saying there in the studio, this is why we talk about the level of maladministration and corruption within the civilian group, politicians in Africa. Because some of these things we are seeing, they don't happen elsewhere. So when governments come in other climb, Sena climb, they are just there to serve the people. But in Africa, they will say they are Democrats. They will come in. Once they come in, they capture the state, they start enriching themselves and their families and their friends and their associates, and then they forget about delivering the dividends of democracy to the people. If you look at Gabon, very small nation, but about 2.3 million population. But Gabon is the fourth largest oil producer in Africa. So 2.3 million, which means Edo State, our population, we are even bigger than Gabon in terms of population. Although the country has a large mass of land. But when you look at global index, poverty, unemployment, development, Gabon is nowhere to be found. So the country is just there, even with the rich oil resources and with a very small population. You will expect that the GDP of Gabon will be very high because there are not too many mouths to feed, to cater for. But that is not the case. So it's been a question of dynasty of Bongo. In fact, at a time, people were even saying that maybe Gabon should even change their name to Bongo, because that has always been the case. As we speak, this president that was removed, the son was also being prepared. Bongo Valentin. He was a key player in the government that was removed.
Take over from the father.
That is, yeah, he's already been prepared over from the father. So that is why you see the joy and the elation with the people. And what makes this Gabon, I need to really hammer on this important part, is that this last election that they did, the opposition came together to say, no, we have to remove this president. Yet, they rigged the election, manipulated it. Voting materials didn't arrive on time. They didn't allow, like I said, observers or monitors. They cut off journalists and all that. So the election was rigged. Bongo, if you look at the man, they say health comes from God. I'm not trying to ridicule him. If you look at his health condition, he's not been feeling well since 2010 when he had a stroke. When you watch him on TV, his mobility, and people are even questioning his mental ability. So this election, they released the result. Their electoral commission released the result. He had 64%. Where did that come from? And then the military struck. It's a lesson for African political leaders.
Okay, let's quickly now come back to you. Our president and commander-in-chief of armed forces, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, is saying there's no need for these military actions in some of these countries. What says you?
What I expect from the president to say is the question the politicians, and particularly the president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria just now, should ask himself, and they should ask themselves, is what is resulting, what is the cause of military takeover in Africa? And the simple answer is that democratically, Africans are not getting the dividends of democracy. We've seen a situation, even like in Nigeria just now, the issue of legitimacy rather, is hanging on the neck of the president of Nigeria. So, where you have that kind of issue, do you now have the moral right to begin to question other issues in other African countries? The answer is a no, an emphatic no. So, they should sit down and first tell themselves the truth before they will not think of telling others the truth. In Africa, we have gone through, take for instance, Nigeria. See the lamentation, see the pains. Somebody is telling us, oh, tighten your belt, bear with us, and the person is in the euphoria of lavishing everything the Mother Nature and God Almighty has bestowed on all of us. And yet you are telling the larger population to tighten their belt. What belt do we have to tighten? Have you first tightened your own belt? So these are the issues in Africa. And that is the issue in Gabon. Okay. A president who came to the instrumentality of democracy now made himself and his rulership and a dynasty. And yet you call it democracy? I don't know what AU and ECOWAS will have to say in this matter.
All right, Dr. Agbons, recently, some Nigerians are actually calling on the military to intervene in our democracy, our democratic system. But the military has come out to debunk that statement, and they actually said their allegiance is to the government of the day. Let's quickly have your view before we take the next short of question.
Yeah, while watching some YouTube channels, and some people were doing some survey. It's the level of frustration, but that is not to justify the incursion of the military into governance. Like in Nigeria, for instance, we've been through military rule. If you calculate the years Nigeria has existed since independence from Great Britain in 1960, we've had more military government than civilian. So, but for me, yeah. So for me, I think the civilians, they need to know that they are being watched carefully. I think what is happening now across Africa, because if you look at it, so many African countries now, they are being ruled by the military, from Sudan to Chad, and down to all the one we've mentioned, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, now Gabon. So, and people are already mentioning Cameroon, where we have one Methuselah there, who has been in power since 1982. But I was in primary school when Paul Biya, we've been hearing the name when we used to do quiz and debate in school. So we mentioned his name. He's been there. Okay. So these are the things. I don't know why African leaders are like that. So for Nigeria, I think there are some lessons to be learned. People in power, civilian government, they should deliver the benefit of democracy. Because I was listening to one analyst yesterday. He said the oxygen, for military coup is always from the heartbeat of the population. So civilians should do the right thing, and then the military will not think of coming into power. Personally, I don't support military coming in, but a situation where civilians are not doing what they have to do, then there is more to be desired.
From these issues happening to our African nations?
For me, what we see, the reflection of democracy we see in Africa is tied towards the neo-colonialism of the colonial lords. Take, for instance, in Niger, a situation where you will have the presence of the colonial lords still manipulating things. And yet, these are the same persons who will come up with analysis to say, oh, Africa is the dark world. You tag Africa the dark world. You don't tag your practices in Africa a dark practice. That is the problem. And there is this connivance. See, we claim, African countries claim to be independent, but we are still tied to the apron of the colonial masters. And the colonial masters have seen the genuinity of the instrumentality of those in power to use them for the benefit of the colonial lords. So, and they have succeeded in using these politicians to achieve their aims. And that is also what we saw in Gabon. For goodness sake, you said Gabon is an independent nation. And yet you have somebody in power who is ruling and making mess of the whole system. You didn't one day call him to question as colonial masters. Now we have a case in hand in Cameroon where we have Paul Biya. The other day, Paul Biya went to France for goodness sake to go and celebrate his 40th year as the president of Cameroon in France. They didn't see anything wrong with it. But immediately there is a takeover. They'll begin to shout, oh, don't allow democracy should remain, this should remain. Why are you not calling all of these persons to question? We saw in Nigeria, the last election, how it went. And there is outcry. Nobody is saying anything from the Western world. All they are looking for is what they stand to benefit.
Okay, now talking about what they stand to benefit, Dr. Tony, there were allegations that the former president of Nigeria got the support of the U.S. During his campaign. As a matter of fact, the United States supported Muhammadu Buhari to become the next president of the nation. Do you think African nations are not matured enough to handle their issues internally?
Yeah, for African nations, to be honest, there's this puppet playing. There's a lack of maturity and decisiveness within the African political elite. Like the example you cited with Muhammadu Buhari now. But I think when you look at the context of what was happening that time, they always say that, you know, hindsight is the greatest, you know, wisdom of all. We can't move back the hands of the clock. So, but with powers like the US, a lot of these European countries, France and all the rest, they do interfere in African politics because they are looking at how they can enjoy and benefit from the resources of this country. For instance, like Nigeria now, we have, you know, crude oil, we sell to a lot of these countries and all that for their energy. So they have interest. But what is playing out now is just a signpost to the fact that it is high time that the African political elite, they mature. They should take responsibility and be accountable to their people, and not one puppet in one European country or one superpower like the US or Germany or France or UK. So, because at the end of the day, all these other countries we are talking about across the world, their citizens they are enjoying the dividends of democracy. So we also should do the same for our people. Because at the end of the day, the love of one sole country should come first.
Okay. Talking about the dividends of democracy, will Africa ever be free from its colonial masters?
We can, if the political elites are ready for it. We saw in Nigeria where some persons were the presidential candidates of the major political parties, quote now, we are invited to Chatham House.
To speak.
To speak. For goodness sake, how many candidates in the US, in the United Kingdom, has come to Nigeria? No. So it goes to tell how these colonial lords hold onto us despite the fact that they claim to have relinquished power to Africans to govern themselves via what they tag independence. The germane question is, are we really independent?
Okay.
And to my mind, just now, we are not independent.
All right, we need to wrap up now, but let's take a final shot from Dr. Tony. Dr. Tony, recently, ECOWAS is threatening to take military action against Niger. Do you think that is necessary?
It's not necessary at all. It's a wrong step. I've always said that since last month when the military took over in Niger. ECOWAS need to negotiate with the new leaders in Niger. So that invasion thing, for me, is just brinkmanship and an unnecessary bravado. It's a wrong step. We don't want war on our doorstep, especially Nigeria. Because 8 of our northern states, they border Niger. So there's going to be crisis. Moreover, we are already battling with insurgency, banditry, kidnapping, insecurity. So we need to sort our own country out first.
Okay. All right, we'll be taking that as your final take on the show. Thank you so much. Time is not always our friend on the program. Thank you, Dr. Tony, for joining us all the way from the United Kingdom.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And it's always a delight having you, Emmanuel Obakwolo.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for staying.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the much we can take on the program this morning on ITV from Benin Network Center on behalf of the entire crew members. My name is Daniel Praise Osedebame. Do have yourself a blessed new month ahead. Bye for now.